Hey guys, my name is Emma and today I'm going to be talking you through everything that I've been reading for non-fiction November. So this is going to include books I've finished, books I've DNF'd and books that I'm still currently reading. There's about 5 days left of November at the time of filming, but I'm probably not going to get around to reading any more non-fiction and I'm definitely not going to finish anything. So I figured I'd just kind of do the wrap up nice and early now. Before I get started as well, I do indeed have new hair. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. So let's just jump in. Non-fiction November is a readathon that is month-long, hence November, hosted by a book Olive and one other person whose name I constantly forget, and I'm really sorry about that, and I will link all the details down below as well as any other videos I have related to the topic. So I've managed to complete 6 books for non-fiction November and I'm just going to talk you through them now. I will be referring back to some of the challenges that were set as well for the readathon, as I think most of them do slot into one here or there. There was one kind of duff one and then 5 really good books, so I think that it's been a cracking readathon, statistically speaking. One of the books I read in November is The Butchering Art by Lindsey Fitzharris. This is going to fit into the prompt of past times or pastimes for me, as it is a look at the history of Victorian medicine, specifically the story of Joseph Lister. So Joseph Lister was the man who pioneered the idea of actually using an antiseptic whilst treating wounds. It was the revolutionary use of carbolic acid that then ended up curbing infection rates and saving countless lives. This tracks his life specifically, but has some really lovely segues into other characters within the history of Victorian medicine. It starts with the groundbreaking discovery of an anaesthetic, which changed the game for Victorian surgery. It meant that they could work for far longer, and it changed the emphasis from speed to precision and skill, and then from that it became Joseph Lister's quest to find something that would then help to curb infection rate. It's very easy to read. I blitzed it in a day. It was absolutely fantastic. A bit on the gory side, naturally. It's talking about Victorian medicine where things were a bit gruesome. I mean, any book talking about medicine, especially surgery, is going to get a bit graphic in places, but this one you do need a bit of a strong stomach for, and some criticism has been that it's just a bit too graphic. So if you're not a fan of that, maybe avoid this one. I found it wonderful. I thought it was brilliant, and it really epitomises everything I look for in non-fiction, which is that easy reading style, plenty of information, really fun, informative chattiness to it, and it really was just kind of the perfect like read history. I think it's an excellent book. One that I'd already technically started in October but I continued through to November was The Secret Barrister by Anonymouse. This is an in-depth look at the justice system, specifically within the UK, because I know that it's very different between the UK and other countries. So this is by Anonymouse. We don't know who it is, and it was originally a blog. I think that it has been turned into a book, but done well, because sometimes blog to book can be a terrible transition. This one's actually been done properly. It is just an in-depth look at the justice system, magistrates court, crown court, everything from first being charged with a crime, guilty, all the different how evidence works, how all the different roles, how juries are selected, everything. As with anything that is an in-depth look into one industry, it tends to be from somebody who is from the inside and feels that something needs a change, so it does naturally get quite harrowing in places. The justice system is problematic. There are miscarriages of justice constantly, because no system is going to be flawless, and it is going through some fairly major budgeting issues at the moment, which mean that people are just underpaid and overworked, and it's the case with so many industries out there, which he does touch on in the book. The fact that this is not unique to the justice system, but it does mean that there are a few points which are difficult to read because they are about cases that really will hit home. It does discuss some domestic abuse cases, some rape cases. It gets real, guys. Like, it's not afraid to go there, because of course it's going to. It's about the justice system completely. Like, it's gonna have to do that. So if that is something which you wouldn't necessarily want to read, I wouldn't go for this book, but it was so informative and so interesting and didn't get too soapboxy. Like, there were times where it was clearly that the author was putting forward a particular point and it was pushing home that, you know, I wanted change, but I never felt preached to or made to feel guilty about anything. ironically. So I would really recommend this. I think it's brilliant. It's been making waves for good reason. It was a fantastic read. A lot of the books that I read in November, which were non-fiction, I did a mix of audiobook and ebook, or audiobook and physical book, which I think is a really great way of consuming non-fiction, because the audiobook aspect can definitely break down some of the meatier chunks, and it can be helpful to get that in kind of two different formats. So one that I did mainly in audiobook is, where's it gone? Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. This was difficult to read, but that's really, really important. It's a look at racism and black history within, again, Britain specifically. And one of the things that the author does talk about is the fact that the discussion around black history and civil rights has a tendency to focus on America with Martin Luther King and everything that went over there. And there isn't much discussion about what is happening within the United Kingdom, mainly because of some of our problems with colonialism and imperialism in the past. Every country has an awkward invasion time. Ours just lasted a really long time. It's really kind of broken into sort of 4 or 5 essays. I'd say 5, I think, which focus on a different aspect. It talks about feminism and intersectionality there. Sorry, I can't speak today. It talks about the history. It talks about discussions with white privilege. It talks about the BNP and all sorts of different things going on there. It naturally was difficult to listen to in places, but it was difficult to listen to in a very important way. The bit about white privilege especially was so interesting and so necessary, and is the kind of thing that I definitely want to make a conscious effort to expose myself to those ideas far more. The audiobook is read by the author, and I thought that that was really, really strong as well. So I would definitely recommend it. It's not too long, very, very interesting look at racism, and was brilliant. I've not been listing any of the challenges. I knew I'd forget something. So that one which I just put there is for macro micro, kind of looking at the macro problems of racism, specifically through the microscope of this woman's experiences. Can't remember what the Secret Barrister was for. Maybe self-shelf, because we don't know who the self is. That's how we're doing that today. I'm really bad with challenges, you guys know this. Another one that I both read and listened to was in ebook format. It was SlugFest by Reed Tucker. This is a book that looks at the rivalry between Marvel and DC going back over the kind of 50 to 70 plus years that they have been, no, even more than that. The span of time that they have both been in business. It was a really interesting look at the comic book industry, how it has evolved, Stan Lee and his contributions, which was especially poignant because Stan Lee actually passed away in November. Looks at kind of the different ideals and values that DC and Marvel have stood for, the scandals related to them, the way that the artists have chopped and changed, and just everything about the comic book industry in general. If you're not into comic books, to be honest, you're probably not going to particularly enjoy this. If you're into business in general and kind of how industries and markets and niches work, you might find this one interesting, but I do think it's such a niche specific look at one tiny area that unless you're a comic book geek, this might go over your head and you might not appreciate it. I really like graphic novels and comic books. I want to do like a graphic novel collection for you guys at some point, and I'm pretty much a Marvel girl, as I said in my TBR for this one. But the book was wonderful at really breaking down the differences between the two, and just so many instances that I didn't know about. It's just a wonderful history. There was slight repetition of some of the points, but that might have just been because I read it in such a short space of time. Again, this was one that I blitzed in a day. I had the audiobook going as I was reading, as I was cleaning, and I just like point blank refused to turn it off. I just smashed it. So there were points where a chapter would refer back to an incident that happened a few chapters beforehand, which I felt a bit like, well, I don't need reminding, but then again for me that had only been a couple of hours ago. So potentially that's helpful if you do this one over a slower period of time. This one is for my shelf as well, because comic books go on your shelf. Yeah, I'm great with these challenges. The final book that I would consider to be a really good read that I read was Educated by Tara Westover. Now this book has been making waves. Like, it's been up for loads of awards. It's won various Book of the Year things. It came out last year, and it is the memoir of Tara Westover, who comes from a survivalist Mormon family who live in the mountains in America. I went into this expecting it to be a bit more of a look about education and the education system, and whilst that is an underlying themes, because Tara Westover never really went to formal school, but when she turned 17 she went to college, and she like taught herself basically a lot of the information she needed to get to that point, and then she ended up going on to do like a master's and a PhD, and she went on to Harvard and Cambridge and really did very well in the academic world despite her very unconventional upbringing. So that was obviously a theme throughout it, and a thread of her life, but really this is a look at her family and the relationships in her family and the abusive behaviour that she had to put up with within her family. Her father is like hardcore survivalist. Tara speculates that he potentially does suffer from an undiagnosed bipolar disorder, and that kind of links into it. He is fanatical and very intense, and in numerous instances puts both her and her family in danger repeatedly. She gets injured, other family members get injured, and that was very difficult to read. She has a very intense negative relationship with one of her brothers. There were descriptions of physical abuse that was again very, very difficult to read. She gets gaslighted by relations at different points, and it was just like, it really came out of nowhere. I really wasn't expecting that. So I just want to put that out there if that is something that you don't feel comfortable reading, because there were definitely a few points that really blindsided me, and I struggled at times to be able to read it without feeling very uncomfortable. Phenomenal read, just like mind-blowing, incredible look at a world that I know almost nothing about and have no experience of. My family conventional, very pro-education. I'm not religious in the slightest. I don't know much about Mormonism. I really don't know much about survivalism. So that was just a fishbowl look at something which was fascinating from the outside, but it's really intense, guys, so just be aware of that. And then the final book that I finished, which I didn't really like that much, was Dead Girls by Alice Bolin. Now this is a collection of essays that looks at the dead girl trope within media and the role of a dead girl as a motivator, the use of girl rather than women in lots of titles, but I feel like the book really didn't do what it said on the tin. Whilst maybe 10% of the essays in the book were talking about this, and this was something that I did find very interesting, and I really enjoyed the ones that looked at the dead girl trope and how it plays out in media and our conceptions of it. The other half is basically just the author waxing lyrically about living in LA and talking about Joan Didion essays, and that got really boring. I don't tend to go for essay collections, mainly because I find people crowbar so much of their own experiences into it anyway that it feels very forced and false and narcissistic. Like, you have an interesting topic, but it almost feels a bit like sometimes they can't be bothered to go far enough into that interesting topic to make it its own book, so they pad out the book with half of it being random anecdotes from their life, which frankly I don't care about. I'm here because I'm interested in topic A, not because of your life. And that could just be me being very unfair and uncharitable to a format that I've read very little of. This is literally the first essay collection I've finished and the fourth essay collection that I've started, because I never made it all the way through the other ones. They annoyed me too much. There was just a wistfulness about LA which I found very irritating. Cheap at times about LA traffic and the uniqueness of LA, which read just more like you're a small town girl who's never lived in a city before. So those are all the books that I finished for non-fiction November. It was a bit of a quieter one this month for me, and I just want to talk about some of the ones that I started and have decided to DNF or I'm currently reading. So I did DNF a few books actually in non-fiction November, and I feel like that was a really good move, and I'm trying to get more comfortable with the concept of DNFing non-fiction when it just doesn't work for me. So the first one that I DNF is here. It's still got the bookmark in it. It's 100 Nasty Women of History by Hannah Jewell. So this, as the name suggests, is just literally the biography, like mini biographies of 100 pretty badass women in history. It should be so up my street, but it's not, because the writing style is almost impossible to get on board with, and I really tried. So the author, Hannah Jewell, used to be one of the senior writers and editors for BuzzFeed. It's probably all I really need to say about the writing style. There's just an obsessive focus on slang and trying to be hip and cool. At one point she refers to one of the women as lit. There's very little discussion about the history, but a lot of like, blah, so she did some stuff and like there was a load of fighting, and if you're into that history thing or whatever, but basically she was a badass, and you're like, that's not telling me anything about her. Like, I've no idea who this woman is or who they for. That's why I'm reading this book. You can't just brush off a bunch of stuff because you can't be bothered to research it potentially, or you're trying to be like down with the kids or something. It just didn't work for me. Another one that I DNF'd that I had on audiobook was Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, and this is entirely because of the audiobook format. Richard Dawkins has a very posh accent, like stereotypically posh accent, stereotypically academic accent, potentially like RP received pronunciation type accent, and I found that very jarring to listen to. There was also a female narrator who would jump in when it was a direct quotation from something else. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up a physical copy because it is something that I'm interested in. I did start reading Dawkins The Selfish Gene about 7 or 8 years ago now. I borrowed a copy from somebody when we were on a coach journey, and I only got about a chapter in before the coach journey ended, and then he was going back home for the holidays and I didn't want to like nick his book, so I never actually got around to finishing it. So I do want to pick it up at some point and read it properly, but the audiobook format is not something that I can get behind for this particular one. One that I have on the go at the moment, and I don't know if I'm going to end up DNFing it or not, is The Disappearing Spoon by Sam Kean. This is a look at the periodic table and how it was formed, and just some really quirky, funky stories related to the different elements and kind of their discovery and subsequent uses. It's interesting, but I'm finding his particular writing style very difficult. I'm about 15 or 20% of the way through, and there's just no desire to keep picking it up. Like, I started it probably in the first week of November, and I've just been prioritizing everything else over it. This one is just not hitting those buttons, like it's not ticking the boxes for me. I did also start Julian Baggini's How the World Thinks, A Global History of Philosophy. I got past the introduction. I'm only a little way through. I am enjoying it. It's quite intense because it's about philosophy, and Julian Baggini can sometimes have quite a strong writing style that's like very information heavy. I'm definitely interested in continuing, but right now I'm not in the mood for that. So I think that's it from me for non-fiction November. It has been really fun prioritising non-fiction. So that's pretty much it from me. I will chat to you guys soon. Have a wonderful reading week, and yeah, bye!